I've been working in design of one form or another for around 25 years. And I'm not going to talk too much about myself, hopefully enough to give this talk some context. But what I'd really like to do is communicate some ideas, some radical thinking, which in some way has affected the direction of my professional life. I'm also going to sneak in some references to books along the way, which some of which we've covered in the meetup UX Belfast, which John mentioned at the start. A bit like Creative Mornings, UX Belfast started as a book club which has chapters in a lot of major cities, and we tend to base that around books which cover or which address a particular theme. So there's a kind of similarity there. But the first thing I want to start off with is that resourcefulness is more important than talent. And I can say this in all confidence because this applies to me and to my life. I don't want to fall into a kind of narrative fallacy, if you like, of somehow looking back and saying that all the pieces make sense in retrospect, because I do not have a blueprint or a template for a stellar career in design. But I do have some ideas which might help you if you're starting out or whatever line of design or creativity you work in. I'm hoping that some of this resonates with you. So my definition of resourcefulness, I would say, is a mix of curiosity and humility and creativity, and essentially having a growth mindset. I was about 5 or 6 years into a career as a graphic designer when I realized that I wasn't a very good one. And it was quite difficult at the time to admit this to myself. I had something of an ego as a designer, but it really shouldn't have come as much of a shock. I hadn't been a great student. What design education I had, I kind of stumbled through. I had no mentors. I wasn't looking for any. And I sleepwalked through those first years of my career. So I would love to tell you how from that moment I committed myself to becoming excellent in every way and improving myself at every conceivable opportunity. I would love to tell you that, but I can't, because it's not true. But I did start down a pathway of asking myself what I needed to do to get better. Now, I found myself feeling like this at a number of points in my career since. I hope that brightens up your morning, by the way. We could just stare at this for a while if you want. Since then, I've moved through graphic design and dealing with style primarily, through interaction design and trying to create engagement, through to generating value and seeing design as return on investment, and more recently, designing for outcomes and trying to create impact and change through my work. So for me, it has felt like a number of careers in one. I've been something of a journeyman in that regard. But at each one of those points of pivot, at each one of those shifts, I've done that consciously by asking myself essentially the same question, which is what do you do next? So when I realized that I wasn't the designer I wanted to be, I began to ask this. I began to ask, what do I need to learn? What do I need to do? What do I need to become to be that designer? And I joked there about committing myself to excellence. It wasn't like that, but I did want to improve. And I wanted to move beyond where I was, where I felt I was stuck, and try and uncover a greater potential and power for the design that I was creating. So it was something of a slow process, I have to say. This didn't happen overnight. It's taken quite a few years, but everything I've done since then, and everything that I've turned to, it has been from this frantic sense of wanting to make up for lost time, and this, trying to play catch up and making up for all of the opportunities that I'd lost in those earlier years. So along the way, there have been certain models and certain thinking which has changed my outlook on design and the direction I was headed. I hope I don't resort to any empty platitudes during any of this. And like I say, whatever work you're involved with, I hope this will resonate with you. But here's the first big idea which took root in my head after I had had that kind of moment of clarity. And that is that effective beats cool every time. In that early part of my career, I was just chasing trends, really. I was pursuing something that might look good in my portfolio. I wanted to design things that other designers would think were cool. So I was designing for myself and designing for other designers. And I do think that this is a trap that designers earlier in their career can get stuck in, where you want to get stuff up and dribble and get a lot of great feedback for it. But that's where I was. And if you think that one of the main aspects of my work now is user-centered design, this was the opposite end of the scale. This was me-centered design. So there were certain things that nudged me off my perch. And one of the first things that really made a profound impact on me was this. This is a diagram, a model titled the Elements of User Experience. This was put together by a man called Jesse James Garrett, who had been an information architect. It's one of the main disciplines of user experience. He had been a founder of the Information Architecture Institute. He was a co-founder of a strategy agency called Adaptive Path, who interestingly were bought over quite a few years later by Capital One Bank to be their in-house design department. They were bought over in a kind of flurry of acquisitions of design agencies a few years ago. But what Garrett did with this model was he pulled together a whole lot of disparate elements of thinking from the field of design, from the field of human-computer interaction, which user experience had evolved from, and some parts of Alan Cooper's work. Alan Cooper had been a developer who introduced the idea of personas and kind of designing for personas in software. And he brought this kind of amorphous, abstract collection of ideas around user experience and collated it into this very succinct model. So he published this in 2000. It was a few years after that before I got exposure to it. User experience at that time was well established, in the US, in major cities. Hadn't quite made its way here yet, certainly not under that name, although there were some agencies banging the drum very early on. But for me, this was revelatory, because what this screamed at me was that what I was trying to do in creating interfaces pretty much with no grounding in anything, it was saying that you're not solving any problems. If you work in visual design, and I'll not read this out verbatim, but you can see in this hierarchy, Garrett was saying that you need to start with objectives and goals, both for your business and for the users who are going to interact with this. And then you work up through this hierarchy, and you layer up your solution. And only at a certain point, after you've solved all the problems at the lower levels, is it time for visual design and interface design. So like so many designers, I saw my work as just so important. And I would jump into Photoshop or Illustrator, and I'd start pulling together the best looking interface ever. But what this showed me was that there was a process that I could adhere to and that I should adhere to. And at this time, there were other design processes, of course. But to give this some context on a timeline, this was even before the Design Council's Double Diamond model emerged. And this was the first real process that I could make sense of and see that I needed to adopt. So this showed me there was a how to do this. And at the base of that, on the very base of that, in the objectives and the user needs, there's a big question around why. Why would you be doing this in the first place? And that was kind of the next question that I was asking. Why do we do these things? Oh, sorry. I meant to say there was a book that came out of that model as well, The Elements of User Experience. So people don't buy products, we invest in future versions of ourselves. This is an idea that altered my outlook massively. Now, clearly, there are things that in life that we have to buy. So if you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we need food, we need heat, we need energy. There are basic staples in our lives that we need. So this relates to anything that we choose to buy for ourselves, anything that we opt into buying. And when we buy, say, a new piece of tech, when we take out a new subscription to a new service, what we'll be doing over lockdown, buying maybe new cooking equipment or baking equipment. And when we do that, we're imagining a future version of ourselves that is better in some way. And we're making an investment in that person. And this is best illustrated by something that was produced around 7 years ago, I think. This is from useronboard.com. And this is talking about aspirations and expectations. With very few exceptions, you invest in a product or service because of the outcomes that it delivers. Whether you're going to save time, you're going to save money, save hassle, you want yourself to be more efficient or more effective. That's the future version of yourself. What I love about this is implicit here is a story or narrative about why someone wants to achieve this or become this. So what this might suggest is, some kind of advertising pursuit of selling an ideal or framing a product. But that work comes afterwards. That work comes when there's a fully formed product to take to the market. In design, we need to understand this story and articulate this at the outset, such that it can become our vision or North Star to work towards in terms of what we're providing for people. So we need to understand what someone's personal Super Mario is, and that informs our work. As designers, we need to know this. We also need to know this as teams. Organizations need to know this about their customers and users. So this isn't something that, this isn't a story that's put together and is told and broadcast by an organization. Once these stories are understood, these can be internalized in organizations, can help organizations become more customer-centric and help to align teams. So this aligns clearly with Theodore Levitt's quotes. Theodore Levitt was a Harvard Business School professor in the 1960s, and one of his most famous quotes is, "People don't want a quarter-inch drill, they want a quarter-inch hole." What he's saying is that people don't want to use tools necessarily, they want the results that those tools provide. And a good user experience or product experience is about delivering those outcomes. So features are the what of your product or service, and the benefits, and that story is the why. So story and narrative is important to good design. And it's hard to find a better example of this kind of storytelling than the launch of the original iPod back in 2001. Steve Jobs was obviously a great design thinker of our time, but he was also a great storyteller, and he was an advocate for the power of storytelling. So this line of 1,000 songs in your pocket, that accompanied the iPod at its launch. It was used in press ads, etc. Jobs used that in the original presentation for launching the iPod, and if you can find it on YouTube, it's well worth revisiting, because he was so good at this this idea of telling a story, talking about all the problems you had that you didn't know about, and then inevitably leading to the new Apple product. And in this presentation, Jobs talked about, this is your entire music collection in your pocket. And he couldn't have been more precise or laser focused on the outcomes that the iPod was going to deliver for you. And this was highlighted by this book, The User's Journey by Donna Lishaw. We covered this in UX Belfast. And she chose this example of Steve Jobs, teasing the audience with this idea of what a music player of the future could be. And then finally, just taking the iPod out of his pocket and showing it to anyone. So that shows the clear value of of talking about benefits over features and weaving this narrative. So features will deliver the benefits of what it is you're creating, but how do you choose the right features? Products have only 4 types of features. This was a suggestion put forward in the 80s by Noriaki Kano, who was a researcher and educator in Japan. And in a paper that he published around then, he was challenging a conventional kind of wisdom that if you improve any aspect of a product or a service, that will inevitably lead to overall increases in customer satisfaction. And that's what he was focused on. And that's how he phrased it, customer satisfaction. But he published a paper, and in it he included something called the Kano model. And the Kano model is based on 2 main premises. First, that features can be classified into 4 categories. And second, that a user satisfaction, or we could say a user's experience, the quality of that experience, depends on the level of functionality that is provided. That is, which features are there and how well they're implemented. So the Kano model takes the form of a quadrant model, and I love quadrant models, so I'm delighted to talk about this. On the x-axis of the Kano model, Kano was talking about implementation. So if you have a feature, you can, or if you have an idea for a feature, you can have very little or no implementation of it at all, right over to best implementation. So that scale will depend on how much time or effort or resource is applied to it. On the y-axis, this refers to what he termed customer satisfaction. And this goes from a scale of frustration through to, various levels. And ultimately, it goes to the nirvana of delight, which I think is an overused term in design, I have to say. It's right up there with cool for me. However, that was the scale of customer satisfaction, as Kano put it. And in this kind of landscape, he placed the 4 categories of features. Now, I'm going to use an analogy to communicate these, so hopefully it'll come across okay. The first category, he said, were basic or must-be features. These are features which had to be in a product before you could even, get to the table, before you could even begin to compete. I'm going to use the analogy of a hotel room. If you can remember what staying in a hotel was like, if you can imagine that if you have hot running water in your room, you're not going to run to TripAdvisor and begin leaving a review about how great your room is because you had hot running water. But if you didn't have hot running water, you may well go to TripAdvisor and leave a review saying that your stay was terrible because you didn't have this. So must-be features are most notable by their absence. The next category were what he termed indifferent or unimportant features. These are things that no matter how much you invest in, you will get little or no return in terms of customer satisfaction. So an example might be a bedside lamp in your hotel room. A hotel could spend £25 on a lamp, or they could spend £250 on a lamp. But as a customer, you're not really going to care. You've got some light beside your bed. So these are potential money sinks for people in products and customer service. The next category, where it gets interesting, are called performance features. So these are things that people expect, but you can get a return in terms of sentiment from them the more that you invest in them. So in your hotel room, it may be the bed. As a customer, you expect the bed, but if you have an uncomfortable bed, you're going to be very dissatisfied. But if you get a really luxuriant bed and you had an excellent night's sleep, then you're going to be extremely happy about that. So these are things that you can invest in and get a directly proportional return on the investment that you make in them. Finally, there are attractive features or delighters. So this is the kind of the where everybody wants to get to. Everybody wants to delight their customers. So in a hotel, these may be free wine left in your room. It may be extra tech that you didn't expect. It may be an additional free meal that was part of the deal that you didn't know about, or that you were given. And these will create an optimal experience for your users or customers. What Kano also included was something which sounds a note of caution for anybody creating products, and that is the decay of delight, or the arrow of doom, as it might be called. And what he was saying was that features which originally start as delightful features, over time, they become performance features and ultimately become must-be's. So I can remember a time when hotel rooms didn't have Wi-Fi. And if you went into a hotel and you had Wi-Fi in your room, that was great. It was such a, it was such a nice thing to have. Nowadays, if you don't have Wi-Fi in your room, you're going to TripAdvisor. So it's not quite hot running water, but it's getting there. So attractive features turn into performance and must-be features as time goes by. So this model is a great way to start thinking about how your customers are going to perceive value. It's great to start forming hypotheses about how to improve adoption rate and achieve success. And now another harsh truth. Failure is easier to predict than success. I'm a big fan of an exercise called a pre-mortem. A pre-mortem is at the outset of an initiative or a project. The team involved get together and simply catastrophize about the project by asking, how will this go wrong? What's the worst possible implementation of this we could make? What pitfalls are awaiting us as we go into this? So in any project, the people involved could have misgivings, they could have misdoubts, they could have apprehensions, possibly from previous bad experience, which are never surfaced. And a pre-mortem gives space to that and offers a kind of forum for all of that stuff to come out. And of course, what you can do then is begin addressing that. I'm also a big fan of Chris Hadfield, who's former commander of the International Space Station. If you don't know him, Chris Hadfield is the astronaut who played Space Oddity in the space station, but he's had other achievements than that. He's great to listen to, and he's great at talking about the discipline of space travel and how the lessons from that apply to everyday life. And he talks about something called the power of negative thinking. That is predicting what can go wrong and then mitigating the risk. And that's what training is all about, not just for astronauts, clearly. If you think of pilots as well, so maybe Chesley Sullenberger, who was known as Sully, who landed the aircraft in the Hudson River, played by Tom Hanks in the movie. After that incident, he said, my training kicked in. This is what we prepared for. This is what I was ready for. In product and service design, it's not such a natural tendency to think about things in that way. We tend to be very focused on success rather than potential failure. And this certainly applies to founders or anyone who's launching a new product, working on a new innovation. They can fall prey to something called pro-innovation bias. And that's nothing more or less than an expectation that an innovation will be used because it's just self-evident that it's better than the incumbent solution. Now, to illustrate that point, this is sometimes known as the bell curve of adoption, or the innovation adoption life cycle. The fancy term for it is the diffusion theory of innovation. And you'll recognize some of the terms there. You'll recognize early adopters and early majority, late majority, and laggards, or skeptics, as they're sometimes called. And right at the start are what are called innovators, and these are people who take a chance on a new innovation and begin to let the innovation itself gain traction in a market. Now, founders, when they are working on something, tend to live in the future. They tend to live in their heads in a place where what they're working on and what they're bringing to the market is, has been adopted. All the features are in place. Everyone loves it, and it's successful. And they do that out of necessity, because you need a self-belief whenever you're launching something. You need to believe that it is going to be successful, and you need that to maintain momentum and keep going. But that can lead to a lack of critical thinking about the idea. And all of innovations, the truth is, aren't even on the curve. They need to get on there. Now, if you recognize that curve, it may be from this book, Crossing the Chasm, which, as you can see, it talked about getting products established in the marketplace and getting over that gap from the early adopters to kind of mass market adoption. But that actual idea of that curve came from a book called Diffusion of Innovations. And this dates back over 60 years. And in the book, Everett Rogers was looking at how innovations spread. He was mainly looking at the fields of medicine and agriculture. But in later editions of the book, before he died in 2004, later versions of the book began to talk about digital products. So this was all transferable. And the insights in the book were tested in more than 6,000 research studies and field tests. So the insights are amongst the most reliable in social sciences. What he also did in the book was identify certain factors which signaled potential failure for innovations. And at this point, I'm going to talk about the Segway. If you're old if you're old enough to remember when the Segway was released, sadly I am, there was a huge swell of hype around it. This was pre-social media channels, but on discussion forums, on tech news sites, there was just a lot of buzz about something that had code names. It wasn't even named at this point. It was called Project Ginger. Some sites just referred to it as it, and everyone knew it was going to be something around personal transportation. And the speculation was just through the roof. I think some people thought we were finally going to get the jetpacks and hoverboards we've been promised. But this was eventually released in late 2001, and Time magazine dedicated a huge amount of space to it, gave it a lot of fanfare. And in those quotes, you can see, you get a sense of what the hype was like around this thing. This was going to change the world. Dean Kamen, the inventor, he expected city planning and town planning to have to change to accommodate the fact that we were all going to be riding Segways. It will be to the car what the car was to the horse and buggy. So you get a sense of the hype. Now, we know by now that when the Segway emerged, it was a bit of a joke. And these are stories which are still available on the web, which talked about just that sense of anticlimax, that this kind of funny looking scooter had been released. So the Segway was a failure. And it was a failure because, in numerical terms, Dean Kamen expected to be selling 10,000 units a week by the end of 2002, or 500,000 of these a year. In the next 6 years, Segway sold just 30,000 units, according to Forbes. So that was just 3 weeks worth of Kamen's expectations. So it failed. And hindsight's a great thing. But could we have reasonably predicted that the Segway would be a failure in the market? And the answer is possibly. In his book, Everett Rogers had identified these 5 factors of successful innovations. And he said that if an innovation failed against one or more of these factors, it was likely to fail overall. And I'll run through them quickly. They should be self-explanatory. The first one was relative advantage. That means, what is this innovation better than? What is it competing with? What problem is it solving? Do I have a mental model of what this thing's doing for me? Number two was compatibility. How does this fit in with what I'm already doing? Can I adopt this without adapting anything else I do? The third was complexity or simplicity. Really, he's talking about usability here in a sense. How difficult is this to use or to get started with? Number four, there is trialability, which was a made-up word, but he was saying, can this be tested? Can I kick the tires of this? Can I try it out without penalty before investing in it? And finally, observability. Can I see this in action? Can I see the results of it? We might call this social proof nowadays. So what he was saying was, if you tick all these boxes for potential customers or the audiences you're aiming at, it does not guarantee success. But if you fail at one or more of these, the chances are that your innovation will not succeed. So let's play a game of hindsight. If we go back to our friend the iPod, in terms of relative advantage, what was this better than? Well, it was better than a Walkman. It was better than Discman or mini disc. And that kind of miniature form factor for music was well established. So it ticked that box. Compatibility was probably the biggest obstacle for iPod. It was relying on the iTunes ecosystem, which not everyone had. But significantly, the iPod was released around a year after iTunes had been released. So iTunes had had a chance to get established and get a foothold. And certainly working with iTunes, this was very easy. Complexity. The scroll wheel was how you got around the iPod. It made navigating content easier. And interestingly, that's what Steve Jobs had said, that navigating content was the great challenge of the iPad or the iPod. Sorry. Trialability. The iPod was everywhere. You could walk into Dixon's and lift one of these. It was in the high street, so that was all good. And then observability. The white earbuds, they hadn't been seen before, but you knew when you walked past somebody in the street, if they had white earbuds in, that was an iPod. And then they had the advertising campaign, if you remember it, with the big multicolored ads with the silhouettes, and you had the earbuds on those as well. So the iPod was doing very well against these. The Segway doesn't do so well against these criteria. What was the Segway better than? Was it better than walking? Possibly. Was it better than riding a bike? Possibly not. Compatibility with infrastructure. Where do I ride this? Do I need to ride this on the road? Do I need to ride it on the pavement? What's the legal status? Do I need a license? Compatibility with lifestyle. Where do I park it? Where do I keep it at home? Complexity. How does this work? We know there's such great, clever technology at the heart of this, but it looks less stable than it actually is. It looks like you need to learn to balance on it, when of course the whole thing about it is that you didn't. And then trialability. You couldn't try these. You had to take a leap of faith to buy these. There were no showrooms, and they were pretty expensive. And then observability. It looks a bit ugly. People writing these things look a bit odd. And there were no product ambassadors, and there was no social proof. So the Segway was not doing too well. And like I say, hindsight is easy to use on this. But even Google Glass, as recently as 6 years ago, again, the hype around this was immense. But it fails in many of the same ways that the Segway did. And while there is great technology here as well, and while no doubt there will be a niche market and niche markets, plural, for this in the future, it didn't happen. And just to take a look at one software example, it still applies. And not to hammer Google too hard. This was Google Wave from 2009. And you can see from looking at it that it was almost a precursor to things we're using nowadays, things like Slack, things like Microsoft Teams. But at the time, the market wasn't ready. TechCrunch talked about this in 2010, and they said, does this solve a problem? Nope. So Google Wave at that point was a solution in search of a problem. Now, Google Wave didn't benefit from a pandemic in the same way that Slack and Zoom have to kind of accelerate adoption. So yes, bad timing. But all of these things failed because they didn't inspire the behavior changes required to gain adoption. And all innovation requires behavior change. And I'll put this another way. Every innovation, every new product is a potential unwanted gift. And I'm going to talk about yogurt makers for a second. A few years ago, my brother bought me a yogurt maker for Christmas. And what he had actually done was a good thing. He had heard me talking on, I'm sure, a couple of occasions that, hey, I take yogurt on my breakfast now. Yeah, yogurt every morning on my breakfast. Yeah. And he had listened and he had thought, okay, I'm going to buy him a yogurt maker. And so he was doing a good thing. And presumably he thought he was going to save me money. He was giving me access to unlimited yogurt. Maybe he thought I could try new flavors. But what he didn't realize was that he was asking me to change my behavior. He was assuming that I would find the time to make this yogurt. I would now have to find space in the fridge for this quite large container. I would have to order different ingredients. So rather than order, fairly cheap yogurt in the shop every week from Tesco, I would need to order individual ingredients, and I would just have to do things differently. Now, I appreciate this makes me sound unbelievably ungrateful, and apologies to my brother, but this was the fact. And I say this to illustrate that innovations can be well-intentioned, they can have clear benefits, but they do not garner the behavior change that is required to gain adoption. And there are models for designing behavior change or for kind of facilitating behavior change. This is kind of the theory of relativity, as it were, for behavior. This is from the work of B.J. Fogg, who worked in Stanford. For a time, there was something called the Stanford Persuasive Tech Labs, and B.J. Fogg led the work there. And this kind of model says that behavior, or where there's a motivation, where there's a clear ability, and where a trigger is introduced, then behavior is more likely. And interestingly, Fogg put a lot of the thinking that he had done and a lot of the work he had done into this book, Tiny Habits, which was released this year. You may be more familiar with a book called Atomic Habits from James Clear. The books came out at almost exactly the same time, but they do have similar content, and they talk about how small changes can add up to such large change over time. There's a similar model called the COM-B model, and you can see it says where there's a capability and an opportunity and a motivation, then behavior change is more likely. And that again comes from a book called The Behavior Change Wheel. So those are models I've used in my work. They help you to design for behavior change. But again, the stark truth is that behavior change is difficult to predict. Whether you're talking about users of a system or customers, when you're dealing with behavior, you need any amount of research, both generative and evaluative, to understand what is likely to happen and what has happened. Whether you're trying to understand current behavior or trying to design future behavior, it's never as straightforward as simply asking people what they will do. So, what I could have said here is that what people do and what they say they do are two very different things. And this is something that a major US retailer discovered to its cost in 2009. I'm going to redact the name of this major US retailer for reasons I won't go into right now. But in 2009, this company undertook something that they called Project Impact. And this was to be a 5-year project that would improve the customer experience in all of their stores. And what they were going to do was reduce clutter in the aisles, make it easier to navigate through the store, and generally improve the aesthetics of their stores. And the result was not what they expected. What they got back from this initiative, and they had gone to customers in a survey and asked, should we do this? And people said yes. What they got out of it was over $1 billion in lost revenue. And that's a conservative estimate. There are others which are much higher. But sales went down quite dramatically. When they reintroduced the clutter and put the stuff back in the aisles, the sales went back up. And again, this is all publicly documented. Now, there's no doubt their intention was good, both for their customers and for themselves. But their behavior didn't turn out how the behavior of their customers didn't turn out how they expected. So what should they have done? Well, they could have carried out more comprehensive research. Maybe they could have made use of the Kano model to map what they were trying to achieve to certain features or certain changes. But they probably should have run experiments in order to find out how behavior change would play out. And had they done that, in doing that, they would have taken a universal approach to their problem, because all problems can be approached in the same way. I'm going to run through a few processes here, a couple of models, which have also had an impact on me, and I'd like to point out some similarities in them. This is the design thinking process, came out of the Stanford Design School. It's difficult to date design thinking, but it rose to prominence really with the formation of IDEO in the early 90s. Now, design thinking gets a bad rap sometimes, depending on what way the wind's blowing or what day of the week it is. You could read an article saying it's great, or you could read another saying that it's overrated. The fact is that design thinking can be transformative. It's unparalleled in its ability to deliver innovation. But there's a simplicity at its heart. As you can see, it starts with empathizing and understanding the people you need to, or understanding the people you're designing for. And then there's an amount of defining of the problem, ideating, trying out new ideas, and then there's prototyping and testing. Google Design Sprint emerged around 5 years ago with the Sprint book. And you can see there are similar-ish steps. You map out user journeys, you identify where the problem areas are, you sketch and iterate, decide what you're going to focus on, prototype and test. So it shares a lot from design thinking, and it makes no secret of that. But these processes can be further distilled into 4 simple stages. And they are understanding a problem, devising a plan, carrying out the plan, and then reviewing it or looking back. And asking what problem are you solving is a central question to design thinking and Sprint, and it's core to any new innovation. Now, this is actually a radical interpretation of the scientific method, which is, too old to pinpoint. But this particular process dates from 1939 and a book called How to Solve It. It was written by a mathematician called George Polya. And although he initially had aimed this at the field of mathematics, he very quickly realized that this was universal. And he made that clear in this book. And what's great about this is, although this seems like a kind of gross oversimplification of problem solving, in the book, he offers questions that you should ask at every stage, which make this a much more universally applicable process. And this applies to teams, it applies to individuals, it can apply to organizations. And for any of the process nerds out there, you can see elements of lean in here. You can see, the basis of agile, and certainly those other processes we've talked about. And it also forms the basis of Kaizen. Kaizen was came out of Japan. It stands for, or it translates as improvement. It was adopted by Toyota, particularly in their production processes, and used very successfully in the 70s and 80s. And Kaizen advocates for continuous improvement over time. And all of these models, one way or another, are applying growth mindset to a team or organizational context and saying, what can we do better? They also suggest that same question at various points, and it relates back to what I said at the start. What do we do next? And the best professional experiences I've had have been in situations with teams, with businesses, with clients, or organizations, where we're asking this together. Okay, what do we do next? What do we need to learn next? What can we try next? And it's gratifying to find, from that point of clarity I talked about, of saying, I'm not cut out for this. It's really gratifying to find that simplicity and clarity of thought is really at the heart of leading edge processes. There's no alchemy involved. There's no dark art. It's just simple questions. So I'd like to leave you with one final radical idea, and it's one that I hope I've been able to practice. Certainly in more recent years, certainly since I woke up. And this is from Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. I don't call myself an expert. I don't label myself that, but I'll aspire to be one. But in addressing a new situation or a new challenge, I'll assume I know nothing. And I'll leave myself open to learning and pursuing what it is I need to learn, and staying curious. And like I say, in any team situation or any organizational situation, the results are powerful when everyone is able to do that together. So I don't think that's special necessarily. I don't believe that takes talent. I think it's simply being resourceful. And with that, I'm going to let you get back to your coffee. Thanks for listening, everyone. I want to thank Karishma and the folks at Belfast Design Week for including this event. I'd like to thank John and CreativeMornings for inviting me to speak. And I hope that's been informative in some way.